This lesson's on fractional indices. We've already had a couple of lessons where we looked at these index laws you can see here on the left-hand side. For this one, we're looking at things like this. You can see we've got a to the power of 1 over n is equal to the nth root of a. So to give you an example of what that means, if I wrote something like 8 to the power of 1 over 3, what I'm really saying is, well, I go and place my 3 there, that's the value on the denominator, you can see it's here, it goes into this point here above the root. So we've got that there. The cube root of, and our value of a goes underneath the root sign there. So the cube root of 8. So what I'm really saying is 8 to the power of a third is equal to the cube root of 8. So you're looking for a number that multiplies onto itself 3 times to give you 8. And we know that that's going to be this here. If I rewrite that, we've got the cube root of, and the number that we multiply onto itself 3 times to give you 8 is this. It's 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 again gives you 8. So our answer for this is the number 2. Now if 8 to the power of a third is the cube root of 8, which is equal to 2, then I could also do this. I could say I've got 8 to the power of a third multiplied by 8 to the power of a third multiplied by 8 to the power of a third, and that's going to give me, well, if we have a look at what each of these values are, each of them is saying 2 times 2 times 2. They're all the value of 2 each, because 8 to the power of a third is 2. So I'm saying 2 times 2 times 2, that's going to give me 8. Now if we have a look at these index laws on the left, when I'm multiplying the same value constantly, then what happens to these indices? Well, over here I've got 8 to the power of a third times another 8 to the power of a third. I just add them. So what I'm really doing here is I'm doing this. I'm going 8 to the power of a third plus another third plus another third. So I end up with 8 to the power of 1. Now there's one other way we can look at this as well. I've got 8 to the power of a third and I'm multiplying it onto itself 3 times. So right here I've got 8 to the power of a third, and because I'm multiplying it onto itself 3 times, then what I can do is I can power it by 3. So we're using this index law right here. So 8 to the power of a third all to the power of a 3 is the same as saying 8 to the power of a third times 3. So 8 to the power of a third times that by 3. Well, what's a third times 3? It's going to give you 8 to the power of 1 as well. Now the only number that you can cube to give you 8 is the number 2. So 2 to the power of 3. Well, the 2 there must be replacing that 8 to the power of a third, so we can see what we've got. 2 to the power of 3 gives you 8. So for this question here, we've got 9 to the power of a half multiplied by 9 to the power of a half. So we just saw that what we do is we take our value, we put our root sign over the top, and you take that denominator and you put that in there. So we're saying the square root of 9 multiplied by the square root of 9. Now we know that square roots, we don't need to carry this little 2 in here all the time because square roots are the most common ones. So we just have the convention of writing square root 9 times square root 9 like this. There's no 2 needed. So the square root of 9, we know that that is 3. So we've got 3 times 3. 3 times 3 takes us back to our 9. So you might have seen this in the surds video, where we saw that if you take the square root of something and multiply it onto itself, it actually cancels out the square root. We've taken the square root of 9, multiplied it by the square root of 9, we end up back at the 9 again. Now the reason that's happening is while we're doing this, we've got 9 to the power of a half, and multiplying it by exactly the same thing. If you look at what we've got over here on this index law, well, when you take 9 to the power of a half multiplied by 9 to the power of a half, you're really just adding those two indices. So what we've got is 9 to the power of a half plus another half, and that gives you 9 to the power of 1, which is obviously going to be 9. Now the other way we can look at it is to take this index law here. So you've got 9 to the power of a half, and it multiplies onto itself, so we're squaring it. So we can put the 2, that n value there, it's just going to go outside of it, and you can see that this index law indicates that you take 9 to the power of a half, you multiply it by that value on the outside of those brackets, so multiply it by 2. So 9 to the power of a half times that by 2, you get half times 2 is 9 to the power of 1, which one more time gives you 9. Now if you have a look at what we've got here, we've got 8 to the power of a third multiplying onto itself. We're actually powering it 4 times. So if I wanted, I could do it a few different ways. We know that 8 to the power of a third now, that's saying I want the cube root of 8. So that's just simply 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 will give us 16. Now sometimes the format of this isn't going to be so simple. You might see something like this instead. You've got 8 to the power of a third, and because there's 4 of them multiplying onto each other, well, we can do this with power up by 4. And you can see that this index law here indicates that we should have 1/3 multiplying by 4. So what we can do is we can rewrite this as 8 to the power of a third times 4. Now looking at these fractions, you want to be able to break it down and look at it like this. You've got 8 to the power of a third. Now 4 can also be written as 4 over 1. So what you really have is this. 1 times 4. 1 times 4 will give you 4 on the numerator, and on the denominator of this power you've got 3. So 16 is equal to 8 to the power of 4 over 3. Now if you take a step back to what we had here in the brackets, 8 to the power of a third is also this. We know it's the cube root of 8. We saw that in the very first part of this video. And it's all powered by 4. So I'm going to place that 4 outside the brackets. So what's really happening here is I take the cube root of 8 and then I power it all by 4, and that gives me this, 8 to the power of 4 over 3. So what you might recognize is that 4 there that sits on top of the index, that numerator, it's sitting outside of the brackets of this value over here. And the 3, which is the denominator of this index, it sits at the front of the root sign. So we end up with this, a to the power of m over n. So m and n, that's 4 and 3. Well, where did that 4 end up? It's powering the entire thing. You can see it outside these brackets. So we put the a back inside, put the square root sign around it. We're going to power the entire thing by m, and our n value, you can see it sitting there. So we put n in there. So there's one more law for us for these index laws. For these questions here, we just want to convert them into index form. Our first one is the square root of 7. So if I take the value of 7, we're looking for the index or the power that sits up there. Well, the square root means we have a little 2 in there, and that value that sits over here right beside the root becomes the denominator of the powers. So it's really just going to be 1 over 2 as the power. So 7 to the power of a half. Down here we've got 2x cubed, and once again it's been square rooted, so there's a little 2 here. So 2x cubed, if I go and write 2x cubed here, what we've got is this half. That whole thing is a power of a half that sits out there. So what can we do with that power of a half? If we look over here at this index law, that half is going to multiply onto the powers on the inside. So what we really have is 2 to the power of 1 and x to the power of 3. And we have that half still there on the outside, and that half multiplies onto each of these. So it's going to be 1 times a half and then 3 times a half. So I'll just write that out. We get 2 with 1 times a half. That's just going to give us a half. And here we've got x. Now 3, we can write 3 as 3 over 1 if you like. 3 over 1 times a half. You get 3 over 2 for this value here. So what you end up with is 2 to the power of a half, and then x to the power of 3 over 2. So for this question here, you can see we've got the cube root of 5y squared. Over here we use the square root. So over here, if I've got my 5y squared, then my power, instead of being a half, well, this 3 that goes on the denominator of the power, it becomes a third. So once again, we're going to have this happening. This third is going to multiply onto each of these values, and 5 is going to be the power of 1. So we've got 5 to the power of a 1 times a third, and then we've got y to the power of 2, or 2 over 1 if you like, multiplied by a third. So we end up with 5 to the power of a third, because 1 times a third is a third, and here we've got y to the power of, well, 2 times 1 is 2, and 1 times 3 is 3, so 2 over 3. So for this last question, we've got x, which is multiplying onto the fourth root of another x. So there's the other x, and I need to find the fractional indice that goes there. So a fourth root, what's that going to be? Well, square roots are a power of a half, and these cube roots, well, that 3 goes onto the denominator of that one. You get a power of 1 over 3. So a fourth root's going to be a power of a quarter. So what's that going to equal? Well, x is x to the power of 1. And if you have a look at this index law over here, when you multiply these like values, those indices just add together. You can see it's m plus n. So what we're really going to do is say 1 plus a quarter. So x, and 1 plus a quarter are those powers there adding together. So what's 1 plus a quarter? Well, I'm not going to put 1 and 1/4. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place it into an improper form just to keep things in a similar vein to what we've done up here. So we've got x to the power of 5/4. So the final two questions, this one says express using roots or place it into surd form. So we've got 3 to the power of 2/5. Well, that fifth means that we're going to get the fifth root. So I've got the 3, there's the root, and we're going to put 5 there. And the 2 on top means you're squaring the entire thing. Now you saw in the other indices videos that that 2 can also be placed right here beside that 3. So I can rewrite this as the fifth root of 3 squared. And 3 squared is what? Well, it's the fifth root of 9. So there's your surd form. So for the last question, you got 64 to the power of negative a third. And if you remember negative indices, you could actually just go and convert them to positive indices if you place them onto the denominator. So we've got 64 to the power of a positive a third on the bottom there. So if we rewrite that, we've got 1, and we've got the third root, or the cube root of 64. And the cube root of 64, you have to find a number that you can multiply by itself 3 times to give you 64. And that's going to be 4. So you've got 1/4.